In the mystical realm where supernatural beings lived according to ancient hierarchies and sacred bonds, the Silver Moon Clan stood as one of the most prestigious werewolf packs in existence. Their territory stretched across vast mountain ranges, their castle rising like a beacon of power and tradition against the backdrop of snow-capped peaks. For centuries, they had maintained their status through careful breeding, strategic alliances, and unwavering adherence to the old ways that governed werewolf society. The pack operated under the rigid Alpha-Beta-Omega structure that had defined their kind since time immemorial. Alphas ruled with strength and dominance, betas served as the backbone of society, and omegas existed to bear children and provide emotional support to their designated mates. Among all the sacred traditions that governed their lives, none was more revered than the concept of fated mates, pairs destined by the moon goddess herself, their souls bound together by cosmic forces that transcended mortal understanding. Into this world was born Elrian Moon Whisper, an omega whose very existence seemed to challenge everything the Silver Moon Clan believed about their kind. From his earliest days, it was clear that Elrian was different from other omega children. While his peers displayed the typical omega traits of submission and gentle compliance, Elrian possessed an inner fire that refused to be extinguished, a quiet strength that manifested in unexpected ways. His appearance alone marked him as unique among his generation. Where most werewolves bore the typical earth tones of brown, black, or russet in their hair and eyes, Elrian's locks shimmered with an almost ethereal silver white that seemed to glow in moonlight. His eyes were the deep blue-green of ocean depths, holding wisdom and pain that seemed far too old for his young face. His build was slight even for an omega, but there was a grace to his movements that spoke of hidden power waiting to be awakened. The pack elders had declared from his birth that Elrian was destined for Caius Ironheart, the heir apparent to the Alpha leadership. Caius was everything an Alpha should be according to pack traditions. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the golden hair and amber eyes that marked him as nobility. His wolf form was a massive black beast that commanded respect and fear in equal measure. From childhood, he had been groomed to lead, trained in combat and strategy, and taught to view strength as the only virtue worth pursuing. The arrangement between Elrian and Caius had been blessed by the pack's spiritual leaders, who claimed to have received visions from the moon goddess herself confirming the match. For 19 years, both young men had lived with the certainty that their futures were intertwined, that they would bond on Elrian's 20th birthday and fulfill their destined roles as Alpha and Omega mates. Elrian had spent his youth preparing for this moment, learning the skills expected of an Omega mate to an Alpha heir. He studied healing arts, diplomatic protocols, household management, and the subtle arts of emotional support that were considered essential for his position. But despite his best efforts to embrace his role, there was always something within him that rebelled against the expectations placed upon him. His inner wolf, the spiritual manifestation of his werewolf nature that should have emerged during his teenage years, remained dormant. This was unusual enough to cause whispers among the pack, but the elders assured everyone that some omegas simply needed the bond with their alpha to awaken their true nature. Elrian tried to believe them, tried to convince himself that everything would fall into place once he and Caius completed their mating bond. As the day of the soul-binding ceremony approached, Elrian found himself filled with a mixture of anticipation and inexplicable dread. Something deep within him whispered that this path was wrong, that he was meant for something different than what everyone expected. But he had been raised to trust in the wisdom of his elders, to believe that the moon goddess knew better than any mortal what was best for her children. The ceremony was to take place during the full moon of the autumn equinox, when the veil between the spiritual and physical worlds was thinnest. The entire Silver Moon Clan had gathered in their sacred grove, a circular clearing surrounded by ancient oak trees whose branches formed a natural cathedral overhead. Silver torches cast dancing shadows across the assembled faces, and the air hummed with magical energy that made every supernatural sense tingle with awareness. Elrian stood at one edge of the circle, dressed in the traditional white robes that symbolized an Omega's purity and readiness for bonding. His silver hair had been braided with moonflowers, and his wrists bore the sacred tattoos that would guide the magic of the binding ritual. Across the circle from him, Caius stood proud and commanding in his black ceremonial armor, every inch the alpha prince that the pack expected him to be. The high priestess, an ancient she-wolf whose authority was second only to the alpha himself, began the ritual with words that had been spoken at such ceremonies for over 1,000 years. Her voice carried across the clearing, weaving magic and tradition together in the sacred invocation. Children of the moon, we gather tonight to witness the joining of two souls destined by forces greater than ourselves. The moon goddess has looked upon her children and decreed that these two shall be one, their bond eternal and unbreakable, their union blessed by the light of the eternal moon. The magical energy in the grove intensified, and Elrian felt the familiar tingle that preceded supernatural manifestations. This was the moment when the invisible threads connecting fated mates would become visible, when the cosmic forces that had bound their souls would reveal themselves to all present. But as the magic reached its crescendo and the silver light began to gather around the ceremonial circle, something went wrong. Instead of the warm, golden glow that should have connected him to Caius, Elrian felt only cold emptiness where their bond should have been. The silver threads that appeared in the air seemed to writhe and twist, searching for their connection but finding nothing but void. Caius's reaction was immediate and devastating. His handsome features twisted into an expression of disgust and outrage that hit Elrian like a physical blow. When the Alpha spoke, his voice carried clearly across the silent grove, ensuring that every member of the pack would hear his rejection. "The Moon Oath has made an error," Caius declared, his voice ringing with authority and contempt. "I will not bind my life to an Omega who doesn't even have a true beast within him. This creature is not worthy of the Ironheart name." The words hit Elrian like daggers, each syllable more devastating than the last. Around the circle, he could hear the shocked gasps and whispers of the pack members, could feel their eyes on him as his most vulnerable moment became a public spectacle. The magical energy that had been building for the ceremony collapsed, leaving only an oppressive silence broken by the sound of his own ragged breathing. But Caius wasn't finished. With the casual cruelty of someone used to having absolute power over others, he continued his public humiliation of the Omega who had expected to become his mate. "Look at him," Caius sneered, gesturing toward Elrian with dismissive contempt. "Weak, incomplete, a mockery of what an Omega should be. The pack needs strength, needs Omegas who can bear strong children and support their alphas with unwavering loyalty. This one can offer neither. I reject this bond. I reject this Omega. Let the moon goddess find me a mate worthy of my status." The formal words of rejection, spoken with the full authority of an alpha heir in front of the assembled pack, struck Elrian like lightning. The magical backlash of a shattered fated bond was said to be one of the most painful experiences a werewolf could endure, but Elrian had never imagined it would feel like this, as if someone had reached into his chest and torn out half his soul, leaving jagged wounds that burned with every breath. He fell to his knees in the soft earth of the grove, his vision blurring as agony beyond description coursed through his body. Through his supernatural senses, he could hear the emotions of the gathered pack washing over him. Shock, pity, embarrassment, and from some quarters, cruel satisfaction that the unusual Omega had finally been put in his place. The high priestess, her ancient face creased with genuine sorrow, approached Elrian where he knelt in the center of the circle. Her voice was gentle but tinged with disappointment as she spoke the ritual words that would formally end the ceremony. "Elrian Moon Whisper, the moon goddess works in ways beyond mortal understanding. Return to your place among us, and trust that your path will become clear in time." But even as she spoke the comforting words, Elrian could see in her eyes that she, like everyone else, viewed him as a failure. An Omega rejected by his fated mate was an anomaly, a disruption to the natural order that made everyone uncomfortable. He was no longer just Elrian. He was now the rejected Omega, a walking reminder that even the moon goddess could make mistakes. The days following Elrian's public rejection were a nightmare of humiliation and isolation that seemed to stretch endlessly before him. Word of what had happened at the soul-binding ceremony spread through the pack with the speed of wildfire, and everywhere he went, Elrian felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on him like a physical burden. The pack members who had once treated him with the respect due to the future alpha's mate now looked at him with a mixture of pity and disgust that made his skin crawl with shame. Other Omegas, who had previously been friendly or at least cordial, now crossed paths to avoid him when they saw him coming. They feared that association with a rejected mate would bring them bad luck, would mark them as undesirable to potential alphas. The few friends Elrian had thought he could count on melted away like morning frost, leaving him more isolated than he had ever been in his life. Even his own family seemed uncomfortable around him, as if his failure reflected poorly on their bloodline and social standing within the pack. But it was the reaction of the pack leadership that truly drove home the reality of his new position. 3 days after the ceremony, Elrian was summoned before the Council of Elders, the governing body that made all major decisions affecting the Silver Moon clan. He entered the council chamber with his head held high, trying to maintain some semblance of dignity despite the circumstances that had brought him there. The chamber was a circular room carved from white stone, with symbols of the moon goddess etched into every surface. The 12 elders sat in high-backed chairs arranged in a semicircle, their faces grave and implacable as they regarded the young Omega who stood before them. At the center of the group sat Alpha Magnus Ironheart, Caius's father and the undisputed leader of the Silver Moon clan. Elrian Moon Whisper. The Alpha's voice carried the weight of absolute authority as he spoke. Your presence among us has become problematic. The rejection you suffered has marked you as different, as other, in ways that make many of our people uncomfortable. Elrian felt his heart sink as he realized where this conversation was leading, but he forced himself to remain upright and dignified. I understand, Alpha Magnus, but I am still a member of this pack, still loyal to the Silver Moon clan that raised me. Loyalty is admirable, one of the elders said, her voice cold and distant. But loyalty alone cannot erase the disruption your continued presence causes. An Omega without a mate, especially one who has been publicly rejected, represents chaos in our ordered society. Another elder nodded in agreement. The young ones ask questions we cannot answer. Why would the moon goddess create such a bond only to allow it to be rejected? What does it mean for our understanding of fate and destiny? Your very existence among us is a challenge to beliefs that have sustained our pack for generations. Alpha Magnus raised his hand, silencing the other voices in the chamber. His amber eyes, so like his son's, fixed on Elrian with an expression that might have been regret or might have been relief. The council has reached a decision, he announced. Elrian Moonwhisper, you are hereby stripped of your pack name and status within the Silver Moon clan. You are banished from our territory, forbidden to return under penalty of death. You have until dawn to gather your possessions and leave our lands forever. The formal words of banishment hit Elrian like physical blows, each phrase severing another connection to the only life he had ever known. He was no longer Elrian Moonwhisper of the Silver Moon clan. He was just Elrian, cast out, unwanted, alone. I understand, Elrian said quietly, proud that his voice remained steady despite the turmoil raging within him. I will be gone by dawn. As he turned to leave the council chamber, Alpha Magnus spoke once more. For what it's worth, boy, I am sorry. You were not born to be what this pack needed, but perhaps you will find your place elsewhere. The words were meant as comfort, but they felt like salt in an open wound. Elrian nodded once and walked out of the chamber, out of the castle, out of the life he had always known. That night, as he packed his few belongings into a travel sack by candlelight, Elrian tried to process the magnitude of what had happened to him. In the space of a few days, he had lost everything. His destined mate, his family, his home, his identity, his future. The carefully planned life that had been laid out before him since birth had crumbled to dust, leaving him with nothing but uncertainty and pain. His reflection in the small mirror above his dresser showed a face that looked years older than it had a week ago. The silver hair that had once been his pride now seemed to mock him with its otherworldly beauty, and his ocean blue eyes held depths of sorrow that no 20-year-old should have to carry. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, Elrian shouldered his pack and walked away from the Silver Moon Castle for the last time. He didn't look back, couldn't bear to see his childhood home growing smaller in the distance. Instead, He fixed his eyes on the path ahead and put one foot in front of the other, heading toward the wild lands that lay beyond Pack territory. The wilderness that lay beyond the borders of the Silver Moon clan was harsh and unforgiving, a place where exiled werewolves went to die or, if they were very lucky, to disappear entirely. Elrian had heard stories of the wild lands since childhood. Vast forests filled with dangerous creatures, mountains that could freeze a traveler solid in minutes, rivers that ran with cursed water that could drive a person mad. For the first week of his exile, Elrian survived on the meager supplies he had been able to carry and the basic wilderness skills that all werewolves learned as children. He found shelter in caves or beneath overhanging rocks, built small fires to keep warm, and foraged for edible plants and roots. But as his supplies dwindled and the weather grew colder with the approach of winter, he realized that survival was going to require more than just basic knowledge. His body, weakened by the trauma of his rejection and the stress of exile, struggled to cope with the physical demands of life in the wilderness. The magical energy that should have sustained him felt blocked somehow, as if the severing of his fated bond had damaged more than just his emotional well-being. His inner wolf, already dormant, seemed to retreat even further into whatever hidden corner of his soul it occupied. It was during his second week in the wilderness that Elrian made a discovery that would change the trajectory of his exile. While exploring the ruins of what appeared to be an ancient monastery, he found a hidden chamber beneath the main altar. The room was filled with books and scrolls written in languages he didn't recognize, but also with more practical items: preserved food, warm clothing, and most importantly, a detailed map of the region. The map showed not just the geographical features of the wild lands, but also the territories claimed by various supernatural beings. To the north lay the domain of the ice dragons, ancient and powerful creatures who had little contact with other races. To the east were the Shadowlands, home to creatures of darkness and nightmare. And to the south, marked with symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light, lay the realm of the vampire courts. Elrian studied the map for hours, trying to decide which direction offered the best chance of survival. The ice dragons were said to be indifferent to other races, neither helpful nor hostile unless provoked. The Shadowlands were obviously dangerous, but might offer hiding places for someone trying to avoid pursuit. The vampire courts were the most civilized of the options, but also the most unpredictable. In the end, the decision was made for him. On his 15th day in exile, while he was gathering firewood near the monastery ruins, Elrian was surrounded by a group of beings he had never seen before. They moved with inhuman grace and speed, their pale skin seeming to glow in the dim forest light. When they smiled, their elongated canine teeth left no doubt about what they were. "Well, well," the leader of the group said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Elrian couldn't place. "What have we here? A lost little wolf, so far from home." Elrian's heart hammered against his ribs as he realized he had wandered into vampire territory without knowing it. These weren't the civilized vampires of the courts, but wild ones, creatures who lived by hunting and raiding rather than the complex social structures of their more sophisticated cousins. "I'm not lost," Elrian said, trying to keep his voice steady despite his fear. "I'm just passing through." "Passing through," another vampire laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "Nothing passes through our territory without paying a toll, little wolf. The question is, what do you have to offer?" Elrian's hand moved instinctively to the small pouch of coins he carried, but the vampire leader shook his head dismissively. "We have no use for mortal currency," he said. "But you have something much more valuable. You have magic, don't you? We can smell it on you, even if it's been damaged somehow." Before Elrian could respond, strong hands seized him from behind. His struggles were useless against vampire strength, and within moments he found himself bound with silver chains that burned against his skin. The leader of the group studied him with interest, tilting his head like a predator examining prey. "You're not just any werewolf," he observed. "There's something different about you, something broken, that makes you even more valuable to certain collectors." "What do you want with me?" Elrian asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Want with you?" The vampire smiled, revealing those gleaming fangs. We're going to sell you, of course. There's a collector in the mountains who pays very well for rare supernatural creatures, especially ones with damaged magic. He finds them interesting. And so Elrian found himself part of a vampire raiding party's cargo, bound and helpless as they carried him deeper into territory he had never imagined existed. The journey took 3 days, during which he was given barely enough food and water to keep him alive. The vampires treated him like valuable livestock, discussing his potential worth in terms that made his blood run cold. On the 3rd day, they reached their destination. A massive fortress carved into the side of a mountain, its black stone walls rising like a wound against the pale sky. The architecture was unlike anything Elrian had ever seen, combining elements from different cultures and time periods in ways that should have been jarring but somehow created a sense of ancient, terrible beauty. The Obsidian Fortress, the vampire leader announced with something approaching reverence. Home to Lord Walter Nightbane, collector of the rare and unusual. He's going to be very interested in you, little wolf. As they approached the fortress gates, Elrian felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. He was about to meet the being who would purchase him like a piece of property, who would own him in ways that his pack upbringing had never prepared him to understand. Whatever happened next, he knew that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't even imagine. The great doors of the Obsidian Fortress opened as they approached, revealing an interior that took Elrian's breath away despite his circumstances. Where he had expected darkness and decay, he found instead a palace of impossible beauty. The walls were lined with artwork from across the ages, tapestries and paintings and sculptures that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow reflections across marble floors inlaid with precious stones that formed intricate patterns telling stories in languages he didn't recognize. But it was the being who emerged to greet them that truly captured Elrian's attention. Lord Walter Nightbane was tall and lean, with features that spoke of aristocratic breeding and centuries of refinement. His hair was the deep black of midnight, and his eyes were the color of molten gold, beautiful and terrible in their intensity. He moved with the fluid grace of a predator, but there was something in his manner that suggested intelligence and restraint rather than simple brutality. When he spoke, his voice was cultured and precise, with an accent that hinted at origins far older than any modern nation. "Gentlemen," Walter said, his golden eyes taking in the vampire raiders and their captive cargo with equal interest. "I trust your expedition was profitable?" "Very much so, my lord," the vampire leader replied with obvious deference. "We brought you something special this time, a werewolf, but not just any werewolf. This one has been rejected by his fated mate, cast out from his pack. His magic is damaged but still present, making him quite unique." Walter's gaze fixed on Elrian, and the young Omega felt as if those golden eyes could see straight through to his soul. The ancient being circled him slowly, studying him like a scholar examining a rare manuscript. "Interesting," Walter murmured, his voice barely audible. "Very interesting indeed. I can sense the trauma in his magical signature, the way his power has been twisted by emotional injury. But underneath that damage, there's something else. Something that was never properly awakened." He stopped in front of Elrian, tilting his head with curiosity. "What is your name, young wolf?" "Elrian," he replied, proud that his voice came out steady despite his fear. "Just Elrian? No pack name, no family designation. They took those away when they cast me out." Walter nodded as if this explained something important. "I see. And tell me, Elrian, what do you know of your own nature? Beyond the obvious fact that you're an Omega werewolf, what do you understand about the power that sleeps within you?" The question caught Elrian off guard. I don't have any special power. That's why my fated mate rejected me. I'm incomplete, broken." "Broken?" Walter's laugh was like silk over steel. "My dear boy, you're not broken. You're simply unopened, like a flower that has never seen the sun. Your former pack clearly had no idea what they possessed." He turned to the vampire raiders, dismissing them with casual authority. "Your payment will be transferred to the usual accounts. I trust you can see yourselves out." After the vampires had departed, Walter led Elrian deeper into the fortress. They passed through libraries that contained more books than Elrian had ever imagined could exist in one place. Laboratories filled with alchemical equipment and magical artifacts, and galleries displaying artwork from civilizations that had fallen millennia ago. "Welcome to your new home," Walter said as they walked. "I trust you'll find it more comfortable than the wilderness you've been surviving in." "My new home?" Elrian asked, confusion mixing with apprehension. "What exactly do you expect from me?" Walter paused at a window that looked out over a garden where impossible flowers bloomed in defiance of the mountain climate. "That depends entirely on you, Elrian. I collect rare and beautiful things, but I'm not a slave master. You're here because your unique nature interests me, because I believe I can help you discover abilities that your former pack never recognized." He turned to face Elrian directly, his golden eyes serious and intent. "I'm offering you a choice. You can remain here as my guest. Allow me to help you explore your true potential. Learn to use powers you didn't know you possessed. In return, you would assist me with my research, serve as a companion for someone who has spent far too many centuries alone. And if I refuse, then I'll provide you with supplies and safe passage to whatever destination you choose. I have no interest in keeping unwilling guests." The offer was so unexpected, so different from what Elrian had feared, that he found himself speechless. After weeks of rejection, exile, and captivity, the idea that someone might actually want his company, might see value in his presence, was almost impossible to process. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why would you help me? What could I possibly offer someone like you?" Walter's smile was gentle, the first truly kind expression Elrian had seen directed at him since his rejection. "Because power isn't just about magic or physical strength, young one. It's about understanding, about seeing connections that others miss, about having the courage to become what you were meant to be rather than what others expect you to be." He gestured toward the window, where the impossible garden bloomed in its mountain setting. "Those flowers shouldn't be able to grow here. The climate is wrong, the soil is unsuitable, the very altitude should prevent their existence. But they flourish because someone took the time to understand their true nature, to provide the conditions they needed to bloom. You think I'm like those flowers? I think you're exactly like those flowers. Beautiful, unique, and completely wasted in the environment where you were planted." That night, Elrian found himself installed in a suite of rooms more luxurious than anything he had ever experienced. The bedroom alone was larger than his entire family's quarters had been in the Silver Moon Castle, furnished with pieces that were clearly priceless antiques. A fireplace crackled cheerfully, casting warm light across tapestries that depicted scenes from mythologies he didn't recognize. But luxury alone couldn't quiet the turmoil in his mind. Everything he had believed about his life, about his nature, about his place in the world, had been turned upside down in the space of a few hours. Walter's words echoed in his thoughts, challenging assumptions he had never thought to question. Was it possible that his former pack had been wrong about him? That his failure to bond with Caius hadn't been a sign of deficiency but of something else entirely? The idea was seductive but terrifying, offering hope while simultaneously threatening to undermine what little certainty he had left in his life. A soft knock at his door interrupted his brooding. "Come in," he called, expecting to see one of the fortress's servants. Instead, Walter himself entered, carrying a tray laden with food that smelled more delicious than anything Elrian had eaten in weeks. "I thought you might be hungry," the ancient being said, setting the tray on a small table near the fireplace. "And I hoped we might continue our conversation from earlier." As they shared the meal, Walter proved to be an engaging conversationalist, telling stories of the places he had traveled and the beings he had encountered during his long existence. But underneath the casual conversation, Elrian sensed a deeper current, as if Walter were studying him as much as entertaining him. "Tell me about your former pack," Walter said eventually. "What was life like in the Silver Moon clan?" Elrian found himself opening up in ways he hadn't expected, describing the rigid hierarchy that had governed every aspect of his existence, the pressure to conform to expectations that had never felt quite right, the constant sense that he was failing to be what everyone needed him to be. "And your fated mate?" Walter's voice was carefully neutral, This Caius who rejected you? He was... he was everything an alpha should be, Elrian said slowly. Strong, confident, decisive. The pack adored him. I was supposed to adore him too. But you didn't. It wasn't a question, and Elrian found himself nodding before he could stop himself. I tried to. I wanted to feel what I was supposed to feel, to be what he needed me to be. But every time we were together, it felt like I was wearing clothes that didn't fit, playing a role that wasn't mine. Perhaps because it wasn't, Walter suggested gently. Perhaps the moon goddess you werewolves revere had other plans for you. Plans that your pack couldn't see because they were too invested in their own traditions to recognize something new. Over the following days, Walter began to introduce Elrian to aspects of magic and supernatural lore that his pack education had never covered. Where werewolf teaching focused on practical applications of their natural abilities, Walter's approach was more theoretical, more focused on understanding the underlying principles that governed all supernatural power. Magic is not just about strength, Walter explained during one of their sessions in his private study. It's about balance, about finding harmony between opposing forces. Your pack teaches that alpha dominance is the natural order, but that's only one perspective on power dynamics. He gestured to a complex diagram drawn on the wall, showing interconnected circles and symbols that seemed to shift and change as Elrian watched. In the ancient traditions, before the modern packs arose, werewolves understood that strength came from unity, from the balance between different types of power rather than the domination of one over others. You're saying my pack was wrong? I'm saying your pack was incomplete in their understanding. They focused on one aspect of supernatural society while ignoring others that might have been equally valid. As the weeks passed, Elrian began to notice changes in himself that went beyond simple physical recovery from his ordeal. The constant ache in his chest that had plagued him since his rejection began to fade. His appetite returned, and with it, his strength. Most remarkably, he began to sense stirrings of the inner wolf that had remained dormant for so long. It was during a meditation session in Walter's garden that Elrian first made contact with his true wolf form. Walter had been guiding him through breathing exercises designed to quiet the conscious mind and allow deeper awareness to emerge when suddenly, Elrian felt something shift inside him. The presence that touched his consciousness wasn't the fierce, dominant beast he had expected based on his pack's teachings. Instead, it was something serene and powerful, like moonlight given form and consciousness. When he opened his eyes, Walter was watching him with an expression of profound satisfaction. "What did you see?" the ancient being asked. "Light," Elrian whispered, still awed by the experience. "My wolf. It wasn't what I expected. It was made of light, of moonbeams and starshine. A lunar wolf," Walter said with deep approval. "I suspected as much. Your coloring, your unusual magical signature, your failure to respond to traditional pack dynamics. It all makes sense now. What's a lunar wolf? A being of balance and healing, connected to the moon's power in ways that most werewolves can only dream of. Lunar wolves are incredibly rare, appearing perhaps once in 1,000 years. They're not meant to submit to alpha dominance because they represent a different kind of power entirely." Walter's revelation recontextualized everything Elrian had experienced in his life. His inability to bond with Caius hadn't been a failure. It had been his true nature asserting itself against an incompatible match. His pack's rejection of him hadn't been based on his weakness but on their inability to recognize what he really was. "Why didn't anyone in my pack know this?" Elrian asked. "Because lunar wolves don't appear often enough for knowledge of them to be maintained in pack lore," Walter explained. "And because the modern werewolf hierarchy is built around the concept of alpha dominance, which leaves no room for beings who operate according to different principles." As winter deepened and the mountain passes became impassable, Elrian and Walter settled into a routine that felt more natural than anything he had ever experienced. His days were filled with study and training, learning to understand his lunar wolf nature and the unique abilities it granted him. His evenings were spent in Walter's company, sharing meals and conversation that ranged from philosophical discussions to shared silence that was comfortable rather than awkward. It was during one such evening, as they sat by the fire in Walter's private study, that Elrian realized his feelings for his host had evolved beyond simple gratitude or companionship. Walter was reading aloud from an ancient text, his cultured voice bringing the archaic words to life, when Elrian found himself studying the strong line of his jaw, the elegant movement of his hands, the way firelight caught in his midnight hair. The realization that he was attracted to Walter hit him like a physical blow. Not just attracted. That was too simple a word for the complex mixture of emotions that filled his chest when he looked at the ancient being who had saved him, taught him, shown him kindness when the rest of the world had cast him aside. Walter seemed to sense his distraction, looking up from his book with those golden eyes that always seemed to see too much. "Is something troubling you?" he asked gently. Elrian felt heat rise in his cheeks, embarrassed by his own transparency. "No, I was listening." Walter's smile was knowing but not unkind. "You were listening to something, but I don't think it was the text I was reading." The gentle teasing in his voice made Elrian's blush deepen, but also gave him courage to be honest about what he was feeling. "I was thinking about how different this is," Elrian said slowly. "Being here with you, learning about myself, feeling like I might actually be worth something. It's nothing like what I expected my life would be." "And how do you feel about that difference?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither of them had voiced directly. Elrian took a breath, gathering courage he didn't know he possessed. "I feel like I'm finally becoming who I was meant to be," he said. "And I feel like maybe the moon goddess knew what she was doing when she let Caius reject me. Maybe she knew I needed to be here, with you, to discover my true nature." Walter set aside his book, giving Elrian his full attention. "And what do you think your true nature is?" "I don't know yet," Elrian admitted. "But I know it's not what my pack tried to make me. And I know that I've never felt as safe, as valued, as cherished as I do here with you." The last word came out barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of everything Elrian was afraid to say more directly. Walter's expression softened, and he reached out to cup Elrian's face in his elegant hands. "My dear boy," he said gently, "you have been cherished since the moment you arrived here. I've lived for over a millennium, and I have never encountered anyone who fascinated me as much as you do." "Fascinated how?" Elrian asked, leaning into the touch. "In every way possible," Walter replied, his thumb tracing the line of Elrian's cheekbone. "Your strength in the face of rejection, your curiosity about the world around you, your capacity for growth and change. Your beauty, which goes far deeper than the merely physical. Your mind, which grasps concepts that most beings would never even attempt to understand." He paused, his golden eyes searching Elrian's face. "I have wanted to kiss you for weeks now, but I didn't want to take advantage of your gratitude or your vulnerable position." "It's not gratitude," Elrian said firmly. "Or if it is, it's the kind of gratitude that comes from being seen, really seen, for the first time in your life. It's the gratitude of finally finding someone who doesn't want to change you or fix you, or make you into something you're not." Walter's smile was radiant. "In that case," he said, "I should very much like to kiss you." The kiss was everything Elrian's first kiss should have been, and everything his kisses with Caius had never managed to become. Walter's lips were soft but demanding, gentle but passionate, conveying a depth of feeling that made Elrian's heart race and his knees weak. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily. "I love you," Elrian whispered, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "I know it's probably too soon to say that, and I know you might not feel the same way, but I needed you to know." "Too soon," Walter laughed, the sound rich with joy. "Elrian, my darling, I have loved you since the night you chose to stay here rather than accept safe passage elsewhere. I have been waiting for you to be ready to hear it." What followed was a night of gentle exploration and passionate discovery that left both of them changed in fundamental ways. Walter made love to Elrian with a tenderness that brought tears to the young Omega's eyes, worshipping his body like something sacred while awakening responses he had never imagined possible. Through their physical connection, Elrian felt his lunar wolf nature fully awaken for the first time, felt the power that had been dormant within him finally find its proper expression. In the afterglow, as they lay entwined before the dying fire, Walter traced patterns on Elrian's bare skin that seemed to glow with their own inner light. "You're extraordinary," the ancient being murmured against his hair. "Your pack had no idea what they threw away." "Their loss," Elrian replied with a confidence that surprised him. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Spring brought changes that neither of them had anticipated. While exploring the mountain slopes that surrounded the obsidian fortress, Elrian discovered a wounded wolf pup that had clearly been abandoned by its pack. The little creature was barely alive, its dark fur matted with blood and its tiny body racked with fever. Without hesitation, Elrian gathered the pup into his arms and carried it back to the fortress. Walter took one look at the situation and immediately cleared space in his laboratory for what would become an intensive healing effort. "He's been cast out," Walter observed as he examined the pup. "Probably for the same reason you were, being different in ways his pack couldn't understand or accept." Working together, they nursed the pup back to health using a combination of Walter's alchemical knowledge and Elrian's growing understanding of his lunar healing abilities. As the little creature recovered, it became clear that he was indeed special in ways that would have made him unwelcome in traditional pack society. The pup's adult form, when it finally manifested, was unlike any werewolf either of them had ever seen. Where most wolves bore the traditional colors of brown, black, or gray, this little one's fur was a shimmering mixture of silver and blue that seemed to change color depending on the light. His eyes were an unusual violet that glowed with intelligence and awareness that seemed far too old for his apparent age. "What should we call him?" Elrian asked one evening as the pup played at their feet in front of the fireplace. "Laos," Walter suggested. "It means of the people in an ancient tongue. Appropriate for one who will grow up understanding that family isn't always about blood." And so their household gained its third member, a young wolf who would grow up knowing that love and acceptance came in many forms, that strength wasn't always about dominance, and that the most important bonds were the ones chosen freely rather than imposed by tradition or expectation. As Laos grew from a pup into a young adolescent, Elrian discovered that his protective instincts ran deeper than he had ever imagined. The boy became the center of his world in ways that surprised him with their intensity. Walter watched this development with amusement and approval, often commenting that Elrian's nurturing nature was finally finding its proper expression. "You were never meant to be a traditional Omega," Walter told him one day as they watched Laos practicing his shifting in the fortress courtyard. "You were meant to be something far more important. A guardian. A protector of those who don't fit into society's narrow definitions of normal." "Is that what you think I am?" "I think you're exactly what the world needs more of," Walter replied, pulling Elrian close against his side. "Someone who sees the value in beings that others would discard, who has the strength to defend those who can't defend themselves." Their peaceful existence was shattered on a crisp autumn morning when messengers arrived at the obsidian fortress bearing news that would change everything. War had broken out between the werewolf packs and the vampire courts, sparked by accusations that vampires had been raiding pack territories and stealing Omega werewolves for unknown purposes. But the conflict was about more than simple territorial disputes. According to the messengers, the Dark Council, a shadow organization that had been growing in power for decades, was using the war as cover for their own agenda. They sought to overthrow the existing supernatural power structures and establish a new order based on their own twisted ideologies. "They're using Omega werewolves as symbols," one of the messengers explained to Walter and Elrian as they met in the fortress's great hall. "Claiming that the current system oppresses them, that they need to be liberated from pack authority." "And the pack's response?" Walter asked. "Predictable," the messenger replied grimly. "They're becoming even more restrictive, claiming that Omegas need additional protection from vampire influence. Some packs are considering measures that would essentially amount to imprisonment for their Omega members." Elrian felt his blood run cold as he realized the implications. "They're going to use the war as an excuse to make things worse for Omegas, aren't they?" "Almost certainly," Walter confirmed. "Fear makes people do terrible things, especially when they can justify those actions as being for the greater good." But the personal implications of the conflict became clear when another messenger arrived 3 days later, this one bearing the silver and blue colors of the Silver Moon clan. The message he carried was addressed specifically to Elrian, and its contents made his hands tremble as he read. The letter was from Alpha Magnus Ironheart himself, written in the formal language reserved for official pack business. To the one formerly known as Elrian Moonwhisper, the Silver Moon clan formally accuses Lord Walter Nightbane of kidnapping and corrupting one of our former members through unnatural means. You are commanded to return to pack territory immediately to testify regarding the circumstances of your capture and subsequent treatment. Failure to comply will result in your being declared an enemy of all werewolf kind. Furthermore, you are charged with harboring a dangerous magical anomaly in the form of the wolf pup known as Laos. This creature must be surrendered to pack authorities for proper evaluation and, if necessary, disposal according to ancient laws. You have 7 days to comply with these demands. After that time, we will consider you hostile and will act accordingly. The letter fell from Elrian's nerveless fingers, fluttering to the floor like a wounded bird. Walter read it quickly, his golden eyes growing cold with anger as he processed the threats contained within. They want to take Laos, Elrian whispered, his voice breaking. They want to kill him for being different, just like they cast me out. They want to take you too, Walter pointed out grimly. Back to a life that nearly destroyed you, away from everything you've built here. Elrian straightened, feeling his lunar wolf nature respond to the threat to his chosen family. Then they're going to be disappointed. I'm not the same person they cast out, and I won't let them hurt Laos. What are you saying? I'm saying we fight, Elrian replied, his voice growing stronger with each word. Not just for ourselves, but for every Omega who's been told they're worthless. For every supernatural being who doesn't fit into society's narrow categories. If they want a war, we give them one. Walter's smile was proud and fierce. My brave lunar wolf. Yes, we fight, but not alone. Over the following days, messengers carried word to every corner of the supernatural world, calling for beings who had been cast out, rejected, or marginalized by traditional society to gather at the Obsidian Fortress. The response was overwhelming. They came from every race and background imaginable. Omega werewolves who had fled restrictive packs, vampires who had been exiled from their courts for refusing to participate in the raiding culture, dragons who had been cast out for showing mercy to lesser beings, and dozens of other supernatural creatures who had found themselves unwelcome in their birth communities. Look at them, Walter said to Elrian as they stood on the fortress walls, watching the growing encampment in the valley below. Every one of them has a story like yours, cast out for being different, rejected for failing to conform to expectations that were never fair in the first place. They're looking to us for leadership, Elrian observed, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. What if we fail them? We won't, Walter said firmly, because we're not fighting for conquest or domination. We're fighting for the right to exist, to love whom we choose, to build families based on choice rather than obligation. The inevitable confrontation came sooner than expected. Instead of waiting the full 7 days specified in their ultimatum, the Silver Moon clan arrived at the head of a massive coalition army on the 5th day. But they weren't alone. Vampire forces flanked them on both sides, suggesting that the two sides had temporarily put aside their differences to deal with what they saw as a greater threat. Elrian stood on the walls of the Obsidian Fortress, watching the approaching army with a mixture of fear and determination. Somewhere among those forces was Caius, the Alpha who had rejected him and set in motion the chain of events that had led to this moment. Part of him wondered what his former fated mate thought of the person he had become, whether Caius ever regretted the choice he had made that night in the sacred grove. Are you ready for this? Walter asked, moving to stand beside him. No, Elrian replied honestly, but I'm going to do it anyway. The battle that followed would be remembered in supernatural history as the War of Choice, a conflict that fundamentally changed the relationship between different races and challenged assumptions about strength, power, and the nature of family itself. Elrian fought with a ferocity that surprised even himself, his lunar wolf abilities manifesting in ways that left his enemies stunned and his allies inspired. He could heal wounded fighters with a touch, could blind attackers with bursts of moonlight, could coordinate the actions of his diverse army through empathic connections that transcended species boundaries. But it was his confrontation with Caius that would define the conflict's ultimate meaning. The Alpha Prince found him during the height of the battle, breaking through the defensive lines with the single-minded determination of someone settling a personal score. "So this is what you've become," Caius said as they faced each other in a small clearing away from the main fighting. "The Omega I rejected, now standing against his own people." "These are my people," Elrian replied, gesturing toward the diverse army fighting alongside him. "The ones who chose me, who valued me for who I am rather than condemning me for who I'm not." Caius's wolf form was exactly as Elrian remembered. Massive, black, radiating dominance and barely controlled aggression. But as his own lunar wolf emerged to meet the challenge, Elrian realized that he was no longer intimidated by the Alpha's display of power. His wolf was everything Walter had helped him discover. Elegant, luminous, beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with physical intimidation. Where Caius represented domination, Elrian embodied balance. Where the Alpha sought to conquer, the lunar wolf sought to protect. The fight between them was brief but decisive. Caius, for all his strength and training, couldn't match the speed and agility of Elrian's lunar form. More importantly, he couldn't understand the nature of the power he was facing, strength that came from love rather than fear, from unity rather than dominance. When Caius finally lay defeated, breathing heavily as Elrian's wolf form stood over him, the Alpha looked up with confusion rather than hatred in his eyes. "I don't understand," he gasped. "You were weak, broken. I did what was best for the pack." Elrian shifted back to human form, looking down at the Alpha who had once held such power over his life. "You did what was easiest for you," he corrected gently. "You chose fear over courage, tradition over growth, the approval of others over the truth of your own heart." "You think I wanted to reject you?" Caius demanded, struggling to sit up. "You think it was easy to tear apart our bond?" "I think you were terrified of what loving me might mean," Elrian replied. "I think you were afraid that accepting an Omega who didn't fit your expectations would make you appear weak to the pack. I think you chose your reputation over our happiness." The truth in his words hit Caius like a physical blow. For the first time since Elrian had known him, the proud Alpha's mask cracked, revealing the fear and regret that had driven his actions. "I was afraid," Caius admitted, his voice barely audible. "Afraid of what the elders would say. Afraid of how the pack would see me if I bonded with someone they considered defective. I thought I was being strong, making the hard choice for the greater good." "The greater good," Elrian repeated, but his voice held no mockery, only sadness. "Do you see what your greater good has led to? War between the races, Omegas imprisoned by their own packs, beings like Laos hunted simply for existing. Around them, the sounds of battle were fading as word of Caius's defeat spread through both armies. The coalition forces, seeing their champion beaten, began to withdraw. But Elrian wasn't finished with his former fated mate. "I'm grateful to you, Caius," he said, extending his hand to help the defeated Alpha to his feet. "You showed me the path to true strength, not in submission to others' expectations, but in the freedom to be myself." Caius took the offered hand, allowing Elrian to pull him upright. "What happens now?" "Now you go back to your pack and tell them that the old ways are ending. Tell them that strength comes in many forms, that love transcends species boundaries, that families can be chosen as well as born." Elrian's voice grew stronger with each word. "Tell them that the beings they cast out have found something better than what they left behind." In the aftermath of the War of Choice, the supernatural world began to change in ways that would have seemed impossible just months before. The Obsidian Fortress became a haven for rejected and marginalized beings from every race, a place where difference was celebrated rather than feared. Elrian found himself at the center of these changes, serving as a leader and protector for those who had nowhere else to turn. His relationship with Walter deepened and evolved, becoming a partnership that balanced love with shared purpose. Together, they created something unprecedented, a multiracial community based on choice rather than birth, on acceptance rather than conformity. Laos grew up in this environment, becoming a symbol of hope for a new generation of supernatural beings who would know from birth that their worth wasn't determined by how well they fit into traditional categories. Under Elrian's guidance, he developed into a confident young man whose unique abilities were celebrated rather than feared. Years later, when Caius came to the fortress, alone, scarred from battles that had cost him everything he thought he valued, Elrian was waiting for him. "I've come to ask your forgiveness," the former Alpha said, his pride finally broken by the weight of his choices. "For what I did to you, for the pain I caused, for the opportunities one destroyed through my cowardice." Elrian studied the man who had once been his fated mate, seeing in him the wreckage of a life built on fear and false values. But he also saw something else, the possibility of redemption, of growth, of change that could still happen even after so much damage had been done. "I forgive you," Elrian said simply, "not because you deserve it, but because holding on to that anger would poison the happiness I found. You're no longer my Alpha, Caius. You're no longer the person whose approval I need or whose rejection can wound me. But I don't wish you harm, and that's my true victory. Could I stay here?" Caius asked, his voice breaking. "Not as your mate, not trying to reclaim what I threw away, but as someone who wants to learn how to be better than he was?" Elrian looked at Walter, who nodded slightly, then back at the broken man before him. "Yes," he said, "you can stay. Everyone deserves a chance to choose who they want to become rather than being trapped by who they used to be." And so the story that had begun with rejection and exile became one of acceptance and redemption. Elrian, the Omega who had been cast out for being incomplete, had found his true completion in love freely given and received. The family he had built with Walter and Laos proved that the strongest bonds were those chosen by the heart rather than imposed by tradition. In the garden of the Obsidian Fortress, where impossible flowers bloomed in defiance of harsh mountain conditions, 3 men sat watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Walter read aloud from an ancient text, his cultured voice bringing old stories to new life. Laos practiced his shape-shifting, his unusual coloring catching the light in ways that made him seem like a creature of living starlight. And Elrian, the rejected Omega who had become a beacon of hope for outcasts everywhere, smiled as he felt the love and contentment that filled his chosen family's bond. He had been right all those years ago when he first arrived at the fortress. He was exactly where he was supposed to be, with exactly the people who were meant to share his life. The moon goddess, it seemed, had known what she was doing after all. She had simply needed him to travel a longer, more difficult path to find his true destiny. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Elrian felt his lunar wolf stir within him, content and at peace in ways that no fated bond could have provided. This was real love, chosen love, love that had grown from understanding and acceptance rather than magical compulsion. This was home.